So Shalom Aleichem to all of you. Slightly different setting. So we usually see each other with a slightly different background. I think you should put the trees down so the sun doesn't interfere. Put the shades down, I think. Yeah, I think that's better. It's better. You see, I'm a mumche in lighting as well, besides all my other amazing talents. So we have an extremely mechubadik crowd here. I'm looking around the room, and it's like being in a yeshiva. The only difference is the age gap, which is uncommon in a yeshiva. We have some elderly mechubadik people sitting around the table, some rabbonim as well, and we have a lot of young B'nai Torah sitting here. So it's an amazing schus. And Rabbi Gottesman is sitting right to my right. And as we've been doing for years now, we have this wonderful shiur every Sunday. The topic we are discussing today is a fascinating topic and a general one. Do we learn halachas directly from the Tanach? And what is the significance of Agadah? Do we learn halachas from Agadas Chazal? Whether these Agadas are on the Gemara or in Medrash or anywhere we find Agadas Chazal. So the fundamentals of today's shiur are actually based on the Yerushalmi. We do not find in Bavli. So the Yerushalmi in the beginning of Masechet Chala wonders, V'chila meiden halacha min hakabbalah. Do we learn halacha from Nevi'im Iksuvim? And that's Yerushalmi, very beginning of Masechet Chala, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph. Yerushalmi wonders, do we learn halacha min hakabbalah? And scrolling up to the top of our page, we have another Yerushalmi, Amoed Koten Yud Alad Amud Aleph. Do we learn halacha from Lifnei Matan Torah? And the sugya the Yerushalmi deals with is Avelis Shiva Yomim. And the Yerushalmi wants to prove that Avelis is 7 days when Yaakov Avinu goes up to the heavens. Vayas la'ovev Evel Shivas Yomim. Yerushalmi wants to learn from here that Avelis is 7 days. But the Rambam, the very beginning of Hilchos Ovel, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, the Rambam writes that Avelis min haTorah is only 1 day and not 7 days. So when the Yerushalmi brings the posuk, Yosef Etzadik v'yas lo v'vevel shiv yomim, the Yerushalmi asks, v'chila meidin melifnei matan Torah. We don't learn from anything that transpired and anything that happened before Matan Torah. And similarly, Yerushalmi Moed Koten Davov regarding Shivas Yemei Mishta. So we have 7 days of mourning, coincide with 7 days of joy, by Chosav Ekala. And where do we learn that from? Once again, Yerushalmi Malay Shavua Zois. That's the story of Yaakov Avinu with Leah and Rachel and his Choshev Shver, Lavan Hu Arami. And once again, it's only a derabanan. It's not min haTorah because we don't learn melifnei matan Torah. So I want to make a very important comment. Maybe we don't learn specific halachas from before Matan Torah, but we definitely learn Yesodus or Avodah and the principles of Avodas Elokim and Dveikus and Midas. How do we know these Magdim and Mitzvahs? Which is a fundamental halacha which no one argues against. Yom Daf Chovches, Psocham Daf Zayin. We learn it from Avram Avinu. V'yashkem Avram b'boker v'yachbosh es hachamor. And no one asks, V'chila meidin melifnei matan Torah. Well, one could say that's a Bavli, that's a Yerushalmi, but Zriza Medim Lemitzvahs is a principle that we find in Yerushalmi as well, and it is one of the fundamentals in Halachah, and we learn it from before Matan Torah. How do we know Hidur Mitzvah? Another concept of Zehiras B'mitzvahs, which no one disputes, and we learn it from Kriyas Yamsuf, Shiras Yam, which was before Matan Torah, and Zeh Keli Ve'anveu, as they left Eretz Mitzrayim, and they said Shias Yom before Matan Torah. So what I try to explain is the fundamentals of Avodas Hashem. Definitely we learn from before Matan Torah, because from whom do we learn, if not from the Avos Hakadoshim of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yankov? But learning specific halachas and details, that is what the Yerushalmi says we don't learn from Lifnei Matan Torah. And obviously the Rambam agrees with the Yerushalmi, because the Rambam says that Avedis is only one day Min Torah and not 7 days. So this is the first yesod that I want to explain. Even if we might not learn halachas from before Matan Torah, but the fundamental principles and darkei avoda and the vekas and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and yesodis amusar, of course, we learn from the Avos Hakadoshim before Matan Torah. So now we discuss, which is the major focus of today's year. Sometimes we have shailas, we find no source in Gemara or in Mishnah. Is it legitimate to go all the way back to the Tanach to prove halachas? So in Minchas Osher, and Baruch Hashem, we have the new edition of Minchas Osher, which is amazing, and it gives me so much simcha and so much fulfillment. But I all the time apologize. I don't remember Simonim in Minchas Osher. I remember the Simonim in Tzayis HaChoshen and Asivas and some Soif and many other Sforim, for a very simple reason. And most of my Talmidim heard this from me many times. Minchas Osher to me is not Gersa Diankuta. So how would I remember? When I was a young man, there was no Minchas Osher. So I remember many Sforim that I learned as a young person, better than I remember the Minchas Osher. So there's a seminar Minchas Osher dealing with the question, is it legitimate to hurt civilians in war? And sometimes it is inevitable, especially in the wars we fight in Israel, when our enemies take advantage of the fact that the whole world is watching and the fact that they know how ethical we try to be while waging war, and they hide under the backs of women and children and send missiles out of residential centers, either because they think we won't attack those sites, and they hope we will attack those sites because life means nothing to them. And for them, it's just about public relations and about the world coming out against Israel. So we don't find any source in Chazal dealing with this question, because these questions weren't relevant for thousands of years. And many times when I deal with different types of questions that come up in the IDF or the Mishtara, the police in Israel, or the Mossad, or even running a major hospital. When did we run a major medical institution? So the Bekiva Ege had a hospital in Posen, which is very well known. So it was one little building. Half of the building was a kollel and half of the building was a hospital. And the hospital, I think, had 5 rooms or something like that. Well, that goes back 200 years in a little Jewish community. And I doubt that they dealt with the questions we need to deal with today. So when the state of Israel was established, and many questions came up, Poskim had to deal with how would the police function. On Shabbos, Rav Herzog wrote a tshuva, and he suggested that on Shabbos, the police ride mules, ride donkeys, because you can't drive a car on Shabbos. Why didn't he suggest riding horses? Because obviously they couldn't afford horses. To feed a horse would cost much more than to feed a mule. So I don't think today that would be a very reasonable proposition that the police on Shabbos should use mules. So we're living in a changing world. And many times I say, it's been more than 2,000 years, going all the way back to the Malchus Shloimo in Bayis Rishon, that we actually ran a state. In the days of Bayis Shani, we had a very limited autonomy, but the Romans were running the show in Eretz Yisrael. So our generation needs to deal with questions that we haven't dealt with for 2,000 years, and it's quite a challenge. So regarding the question of hurting civilians in warfare, I brought various sources from the Tanach and from the Meforshim of the Tanach, the commentaries of the Tanach. But maybe Dina Melchama is a separate criteria we won't deal with today. But I do want to bring various different sources about learning halachas from Tanach. And I start off with a very painful and troubling question that was dealt with in Israeli courts. And some judges in the courts turn to me sometimes, not that I have any authority, but they want to have some halachic dastail and some guidance. So a person murdered his wife. A person murdered his wife. Never would we dream about, a Jewish murderer. It just doesn't stick together, these two words, a Jew, a murderer. But we live in a modern world. It happens. Person murdered his wife, and they had one little baby girl. And then the two families fought over custody of the child. And the murderer sitting in jail said, I am the sole parent, so I deserve to get custody. This is my child. Maybe this question is so disturbing, it made me choke, I don't know. And he said, as long as I'm in jail, I want my mother and my parents to take care of my child. The mother's family was terrified, and they said, you murdered our daughter, and you want to have custody of the child, and they demand custody of the child. And the courts dealt with this question, and they turned to me, and I find no source in Gemara and Bavli or Yerushalmi or in the Mishnayos. Maybe Malachim, maybe Sefer Malachim would be the only source. Malachim Aleph Chof Aleph, we find the story of Izebel murdered the Navois HaYisraeli to take possession of his vineyard and to give it to Achav. Achav was one of the Malchi Yisrael, not the good ones. There were a few righteous Malachim, like Chizkiyahu, like Yoshio, but many of them were evil. So she murdered Navois HaYisraeli to give his vineyard to her husband, to Achav. And Eliyahu Novi turns to Achav in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he asks this piercing question, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. So what would we paskin regarding Yerusha Sabal, regarding a monetary issue? So al pi Torah, Baal Yerusha Ishtoi, person murdered his wife, would he get her Yerusha? So the question I was dealing with is custody over a child, but we could learn from the spirit of the Novi, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. I think the courts paskined that the mother's family would have custody of the child and not the father's family, and I think that was a right attitude, even though the parents of this murderer said, we are not to blame, and we are loving parents, and we would like to raise this child, but I think the child was transferred to the custody of the mother's side. So do we learn halacha from Haratzachta v'gam yarashta? If we would be dealing with Yerusha Sabal, which is a direct monetary question, would we learn from Divrei HaNovi? This brings us to a Rambam. Fascinating Rambam, Hilchas Mamre, Perek Zayin Halacha Yutes, the Rambam writes, a father that brought his son a ben Seder Ramoira lebeistin, Oneinu ze einenu shomea b'kol ovev u'b'kol imoi, and kemitzvah Torah. The child, his life was taken. The Rambam writes that the father inherits his son because a young boy doesn't have any children. And if a person has no offspring, neither ben or bas, then his father yarshans. And the Rambam writes, father yarshans. And then at Baz on the spot asks, Michael Mashmalon. I mean, he's the next in kin, and he is the next in Seder Nachalois. What is the Revusa that at Baz writes? There would be room to argue the father should not take possession of the inheritance because of the Isim Nekiyim Lashem Yisrael. Just doesn't look right. You brought about the demise of your son, and you're going to get benefit out of that act. Well, let me make this clear that Rambam Paskins, he does Yashin. And it is not like a murderer. After all, that's mitzvah Torah. He did what the Torah expects him to do. And he probably did it with a shattered and broken heart. So he did no wrong. And after Pecan, there would be room to argue this doesn't look right. At least it goes against Veisim Nekim. What is a Chiddush B'Yainai that the Kiryas Sefer, who was one of the earliest and most important commentators of the Rambam, that is the Mabit, lived 500 years ago. Kiryas Sefer, that Rambam says that the Rambam sources the story with Achav and Novois. And I don't know exactly how, because I'm not aware that Novois was a relative to Achav, and he was the one that got the Yerisha. So maybe this belongs to the big sugi of Haruge Malchus, Memoinam La Malchus, and Novis was Haruge Malchus. But anyway, this Rambam would be an additional interesting source to our question. So by Ben Soder Amoira, because the father did really no wrong, he didn't violate, he's not an Oiver Avera, he didn't kill an innocent person, and after Pekan there would be a Havamene that he doesn't get the Yerusha. I think this would be a source. If you murdered your wife or anybody that's your Moirish, you shouldn't derive benefit out of this horrendous act, out of killing a person, and now you're going to get his inheritance. And that is what Eliyahu Novi asks Achav. Do you think this will go? Do you think this will pass? Haratzachta vegam yarashta. Oh, so Rabbi Gad has been sitting on my right, and how lucky I am to have him sitting on my right. So the Or Sameach comments on the Kiryas Sefer. Achav Yoresh es Novei Shahaya Krovo Kemavur B'Sanhedrin Mem Ches Amud Beis. Oh, so Rav Shlomo, you pointed out my shortcoming. I did not remember the Minchas Osher. I apologized in advance. But what I'm more embarrassed about, I didn't remember the Gemara Sanhedrin Mem Ches Amud Beis. That's a bigger problem than not remembering the Minchas Osher. So, regarding dealing with this question, an example, going all the way back to the Tanach to learn a halakhic principle. The Rambam is an interesting source, but it is not really a definitive source, because after all, the father is Yoresh, his son was a Ben Zera Moira. We just need to try to apply Svara. If even by Ben Soder Amoira, in which he really had no wrongdoing, there would be room to argue that it is inappropriate, he should be the Yoresh. So one could argue when a person murdered his wife, it definitely is inappropriate that he should be the Yoresh. But I bring this as an example of sometimes we have dilemmas and we need to go all the way back to the Tanach. Is that a relevant halachic source? And this brings me to a source which just occurred to me right now. It's not in our source sheet, regarding the mitzvah of Mishloach Monos or Matones Lev Yoinim. So Agon Rav Moshe Sternbuch writes in his Sefer that to give Matones Lev Yoinim, you need to look for an Ev Yoin. And the Gemara of Metzia, the Gemara explains what's the difference between an Oni and an Evian. An Evian is somebody that is in a higher level of desperation than an Oni. And he writes, Matones Lev Yoinim. And I argued in my Sefer, we don't learn halachas from Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther is Kisvei HaKodesh, but it's not a halachic source. The Rambam, Perek Beis Mehalchas Megillah, the Shulchan Aruch, right? You need to give matanos la'oni, and they don't mention an Evian. And therefore, in my opinion, you don't need to look for an Evian. So I heard a frum person in Yerushalayim. He desperately looked for an Evian, and he found one. And he didn't tell anyone about it because he was keeping him for next year. He said, I made such an effort to find an Evian. I don't want to lose him for next year. So he told nobody about this desperate person. I want him for next year. No, that's an interesting frumkeit. So, and I say, it's the last day that you need to look for an Evian. The Ramban says, in Bava Metzia, if you give matonas evyonim, and even if the person is rich, you still were makayim matonas evyonim. Lachatchili, you need to look for an oni. But by the evid, it's not a ma'akev. Sheyu hakol smechem. How do we get to matonas evyonim? It's another example. Do we learn from Tanach? And I think this is an exception, because even if in other areas we do learn from the Tanakh, but here the Tanakh contradicts the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch. If there would be a din that you need an Evyoin, it should be in Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, Gemara. And it is nowhere, either in Gemara, and the two most important sources are the Rambam, Tur, Shulchan Aruch. They are the three pillars of Halachah. Rambam, Tur, Shulchan Aruch say you need to give matonas la'oni. There's no need to look for an Evyon. Their understanding in Megillah Esther was matonas le'evyonim lav davka. Do we understand better than they? So we don't paskin according to the Tanakh when it is clear that the Rambam, Tur, Shulchan Aruch, Matika Eshmua disregarded the lashon of Megillah Esther about matonas le'evyonim. Now I want to bring 4 halachas that we learn from Yankov Avinu, and they have no source in Gemara. Rambam Hilchos Erechin Perek Yud Halacha Lamed Aleph says, and all these 4 halachas are on the same sugya. Eino the makna davar shaloi bolei yoyam. The Rambam Perek Yud Halacha Lamed Aleph Hilchos Erechin says, Eino the makna davar yoyam, aval odem meschayev davar shaloi bolei yoyam. Where does the Rambam learn this? Yankov Avinu kol asher titen li aser asreni lach. So maybe it was just a promise. But then the Kodesh Baruch Hu says, asher nodarto li neder. That's what the Kodesh Baruch Hu says. And that proves it was a neder and it is binding, even though he promised a davar shaloi bolei yoyam. And the Rambam has no source in Gemara to this halacha, going all the way back to Yankov Avinu. Shuvas HaRivash Meshin Chavches. Then Rivash writes he has a ksav yad, a manuscript related to the Tur, quoting his great father, the Rosh. But if you supplement the kinyan with a shavua, or the makna davar shaloi bolei yoyam. And the Rosh proves this halacha from, once again, everybody could guess, Mechiras HaBechorah. Yankov demands from Esav or asks Esav, Hishavali, and he swears. And the Rosh said, he sold the Bechorah, said davar shaloi bolei yoyam, as long as Yitzchak was alive, and that is why he demanded a shul. And the Rivash says, I don't believe this is a ksav yad of the Tur. How would we know it's authentic? Because it doesn't make sense. How would a shavua validate an invalid kinyan? Minchas Osher, I don't remember which siman, but obviously it's in the parsha of Mechiras HaBechorah. I explained that the Rosh's understanding, based on the Gemara of Metziat Zayin, is the reasoning is because there's a lack of smichus das, and therefore the shavua adds on a level of gemar das, of smichus das, and therefore so today we know it is authentic, and we have Perush Hatur ala Torah, which is 100% clear that that is the Tur, and that is what he quotes from the Rosh Halacha Lamaisa. And this is halacha number 2 that we learn from Yankov Avinu with no source of Chazal, going all the way back to the Tanakh. Number 3 is the Ktsois HaChoshen and Shin Lamed Beis. Ktsois HaChoshen learns from Yankov Avinu that by schirus, person could obligate himself to davar shaloi bolei yoyam, and that's the story of Yankov Avinu caring for Lavan's flock, and he makes a condition, a stipulation, that all the Nekudim and Berudim, they will be mine, and the others will be yours. And that was binding, was a davar shaloi bolei yoyam. But in the context of schirus, Adam Meschayev b'davar shaloi bolei yoyam. So it is not only the Rambam and the Rosh that learn from Yankov Avinu, Ktsois HaChoshen as well. And source number 4 is the very last halacha in Hilchos Chilus in Rambam, which is Perek Zayin, the end of Hilchos Chilus, Perek Yud Gimel Halacha Zayin, the very last halacha. And the Rambam speaks about the way an employer needs to treat his employees. And when we learn these halachas, the Rambam, the Torah, seems to be quite socialistic and specifies the obligations of an employer toward his employees. And the very last halacha that Rambam writes goes the other way around as well. And a worker chayav la'avod b'kol koichoi. Sharei Yankov Atzadik, and it's the only place that the Rambam defines Yankov Avinu as Yankov Atzadik. We are familiar with the name Yosef Atzadik. The Rambam writes Yankov Atzadik. He said, Ki b'kol koichi avadati es avichem. Yankov's employer was not that nice. He was not the easiest guy to deal with. B'yafar Piken, Yankov says, b'kol koichi avadati es avichem. And the Rambam writes that's a sgula for Hatzlacha. Because he acted with integrity and with honesty, and he did his best to serve his employer. So the Rambam writes this as a halacha psuka chayav elavet b'kol choichoi, and the source is Yankov Avinu. So 4 specific halachas, all related to, no, 3 of them are Davar Shel Bori Olam. Actually, 4 Davar Shel B'Yolam, and this is number 5. Now, Yoredei Shin Samachetz Aleph, and this is a fascinating one. Shulchan Aruch writes Halachah, and the source is HaRav, one of the early Ashkenazi Rishonim. Are we connecting? Okay. There's a Gemara in Megillah. Anything that grows in a cemetery is also Bahanoah. Mishum Kavod Ameis. If you have trees that bear fruit, that don't bear fruit, whatever grows in a basic quotas is also bano. Mishum kavod ameis. So there was a story in a town somewhere in Europe. And the poritz, you know what a poritz is? I don't know. Whether it was a king or the emperor or the maharaja or the sultan or just a thug in the feudal system, but he was the guy in charge, the mayor of the town. And he had herds of animals, and they grazed in the Jewish cemetery. And it was a terrible bizoyan, having animals trampling over the kvorim. And the Jewish community didn't have money either to pay sheichad, to pay the guy off, or to build a fence around the cemetery. And the Mariv Vayel paskins, you could chop down the trees, use the wood to build a fence, and sell the rest, and pay off this boss to get his animals out of the cemetery. Even though it's an Isser, so Mariv Vayel says the entire Isser is Mishum Kavod Ameis, but this is a far bigger bizoyan lemeis, and therefore it is legitimate to be over an Avera Bekum Vasei to prevent the same Avera, even though it's not us, but it is a greater bizoyan for the Mason. And therefore, he writes, it's mutar, chop down those trees, use the wood, pay him off, build a fence. And he brings a raya from one of the greatest early poskim. His name was Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda. He didn't write any Shalas HaTshuvos. I'm not aware that we have Shalas HaTshuvos, Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda. But the Navi tells the story. He chopped Kitzetz Dal Sois HaHeichal, and he sent them to Melech Ashur as a bribe. He should spare and salvage Yerushalayim. He shouldn't conquer Yerushalayim and destroy the Beis Hamikdash. Cutting off Dalsas HaHeichal as an Issa Diuraisa, Lo Ta'asun Kein Lashem Elokeichem. But he wanted to save the Beis Hamikdash. So we learn from him, it's mutter to be over, not only at the Rabbon and even at the Diuraisa, but kumpasei. If Melech Ashur would destroy the Beis Hamikdash, Yodeinu, Lo B'Ma'al. It's not us, it's him. But the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed. So Mariv Vayel learns from this Halachah, from the story of Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, that it would be permissible, even recommended, to be over and available to prevent the same result in a far greater extent, and we want to prevent the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, so that would legitimize being over and loitas and Ken Hashem Lakechem and cutting off the doors and sending them as a gift to Melech Ashur. But others wonder, it's a Mishnah Mesechah Psochim, Shisha Dvorim Mosoch Haskio, Al Gimel Hoydolo, Al Gimel Hoydolo. And one of the things that Chachamim disagreed was Kitzes Dal Sasaichel. The answer is a very simple one, and it's Rashi on the spot. Rashi says, Lamu Loi Hoydolo. Because the Navi promised B'Shem Hashem, V'ganoisi alo ir hazeh v'an yoshvei. Kodesh Baruch Hu said, you have nothing to be afraid of. I will protect the city of Yerushalayim and all its inhabitants. So the reason the Chachamim rejected the act of Cheskio was only because didn't you trust the Navi? There was a promise, but if not that promise of the Navi, we would all agree with the act of Cheskio Melech Yehuda, and that is where the Marivail learns his Halachah, and it's quoted by them all. In Minchas Osher, somewhere, Shalos Teshuvas Chelik Beis, I think, there's a very important seminar. I brought about 10 or more than 10 sources similar to the Marivail. Sometimes that we recommended to be over on an Issa B'Kum V'Sai to prevent the same at a far greater or harsher conditions. And this is Nagea Halacha L'Maisa in very many areas of therapy. When we try to treat people that have mental issues like OCD, and we paskin, just go through the davening once, whether you said it right or got it wrong, just don't go back. And others would say, Bitul mitzvah say shall kriya shema, but we say, this is the way to help these people. And we want to get them out of their predicament. So, yes, this is similar to Cheskio, this is similar to the Marivail and many other sources that I brought. So this is another example where we go all the way back to Tanach to learn Halachah, as we find in the Ramo Yeradei Shin Samches. Me'inyan le'inyan ba'oisayu inyan. Is it accepted practice to darshan droshes mimikroi hakodesh? Or is that the right reserved only to Chazal beruach kodsha? We find a few very interesting examples. Whatever I tell you today is in Minchas Osher, and in Minchas Osher there I think there are more than 30 sources in this sugya, but I'm just choosing the most interesting ones and those that are not very complicated. So a fundamental question, and the first one to ask this question is Sefi Reim Ebali Atoisus. There's a din of Hazam. Vasisam loika asher zamem lases la'ov. When an aide gives testimony, and the testimony is proven to be false, imoni heyisem b'mokamacha, the Torah says, whatever he planned to blame another person and to cause him to be punished, he would be punished in the same manner. So when we're dealing with Malchus, we give him Malchus. We're dealing with monetary issues, he needs to pay. But the HaRav says, how do we know that what the aide needs to pay goes to the person he accused? How do we know that? By Malchus, the person he accused reaps no benefit. It's about punishment. So why by monetary issues, the person that was accused, falsely accused, would walk away with full pockets, would make a profit? How do we know that? What would be the other option? I don't know. Maybe it should go like Kupishal Tzedakah. Maybe the basin should get the money and give it out to Aniyim, to Yesayimim. How do we know that it goes to the Nidoin? That's the question the HaRav asks. And we find a fascinating tshuva at the bas, Chelik Gimel Tov Reish Chov Daled, and he says, if not, I would be afraid to darshan a new drosha that we don't find in Chazal. I would say, and that word la'achiv is needless. It's a yitur. What is La'achiv? The money would go to the person on who he falsely testified. But the Radbaz clearly is apologetical, and he writes, it's not accepted practice to darshan droshes. And this drosha is a pele because Chazal already used that la'ocha for two different droshes. La'ocha v'lo la'choisoi, that's at the end of Masechet Sanhedrin, before Perek Chelik, and la'ochiv harei ochiv kayim, horgu ein harogim. And now the Radbaz comes along to add drosha number 3. Chuvas Marik Kuf Lamet says we cannot darshan any new drosha. It is only, that is the authority of Chazal Beruach Kodsham. You all are aware of a halacha that when you count sfira, you stand. How do we know that? What's the source of this halacha? Sheva Shavuos Tisbalacha, Mahochel Chamish Bekamo, Al Tikro Bakoma, Elo Bakoima. This drush is nowhere found in the Gemara, neither in Babi nor in Yerushalmi. The Rosh quotes it, comes from the Gaonim, and it's Halachah and Shulchan Aruch, which nobody disputes. And this is one of the interesting sources that we do find drushes. So it's not learning from Tanach, it's new drushes that we don't find in Chazal to be Mechadish Halachas. Chacham Tzvi Siman Tzaddik Gimel. People that don't know anything of the Chacham Tzvi, but they usually know about this psak. That's the story of the Goylem. The Chacham Tzvi deals with the halachic status of a Goylem that was created with Sefer Yetzirah. The most famous Goylem in history was the one that never was. And that's the Maral Prague's Goylem. This is a halachic debate. I'm one of those, I don't believe the Maral ever made a Goylem. It just doesn't fit with the Maral. Anybody that knows the Maral. It's not his thing, as we say today.
Sold a lot of books.
Yeah, Euler Rosenberg, he created the Goylem, not the Maral, and he was the first that wrote about, the stories of the Maral's Goylem. Not because I don't believe tzaddikim could make a Goylem. Let me make this clear. It's a Gemara in Sanhedrin. Rav Oshaya and his chaverim created Igla Tilsa every Erev Shabbos, L'chavoid Shabbos. Yes, Gedolim throughout the ages used the Sefer Yetzirah. We find it in the Gemara. And the Chacham Tzvi, Siman Tzaddik Gimel. And he was not long after the Maral. He tells us nothing about the Maral, but he writes, my great Zayda created a Goylem. That's what he writes. And he tells the story that he made a Goylem. And Rabbi Yankov Emden, the son of Chacham Tzvi, writes, the end of the story, that this Goylem, how do you say a Goylem in English? I think a Goylem is in all the languages, right? A Goylem is a Goylem. And this Goylem grew and grew, and he became a danger to the community. So the tzaddik that made the Goylem struggled with him, and he ripped the Shem Havaya off his forehead, which is interesting. He had a Shem Havaya on his forehead, and that is when the Goylem ceased to be alive. And in that struggle, the Goylem cut his cheek, and he had a scar on his cheek till the end of his life. That is what Rabbi Yankov Emden fills in the end of the story. And I trust the Chacham Tzvi and Rabbi Yankov Emden. They were the greatest Gedolim. So when I say there was no Goylem, the Maral didn't make a Goylem, it's not because I'm a progressive person. I don't believe in a Goylem. I do. And the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Chacham Tzvi and Siman Nun Hey, which is very interesting. Why the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Chacham Tzvi? I mean, the Mishnah Berurah is Halachah L'maisa. But would this ever be Halachah L'maisa? My feeling is that the Mishnah Berurah wanted to quote the story because, he wanted us to believe and to be tmimistic. And if the Chacham Tzvi writes that his grandfather created the Goylem at Sefer Yetzirah, similar to what we find in the Gemara, Gedol HaMeroim, we believe this is a possibility. But I don't believe that Maral made a Goylem for a very simple reason. according to Rosenberg and all these fantastic stories, it's impossible that none of the Sforim of that era mention this. It just can't be. If it was such a momentous story, how come no one mentions it? Neither does the HaRav. The Spinker Rebbe, the Imri Yosef, was a gewaldige tzaddik, and in his Sefer Ala Torah, he writes, somebody gave me an amazing letter that the Maharal wrote, and he describes how we made the Goylem. Anybody that's familiar with the Maharal and this letter, you don't need to read more than 10 lines to see this is not the Maharal. It's not his sprach, it's not his singing. And Spinker Rebbe was to me, Mr. Kanaf. Somebody gave him some letter. I don't know who composed it, and he believed it's the story of the Maharal. But anyway, Legufan shel Dvorim. The Chaim Tzvi writes, is there an Isser of Retzicha if you destroy this Goylem? Well, I wonder, did the Chacham Tzvi know what his son knew? Rabbi Yankoven writes that the one that made the Goylem destroyed him, and he ripped the Shemafai off his forehead. Was that a Pikuach Nefesh situation? But even for Pikuach Nefesh, you can't kill a person. My chozis. Probably my chozis doesn't apply to a Goylem. But the Chacham Tzvi writes, Shoifech dam ha'odam be'odam dom yeshafech. So the Isser Ratzich is only Odam be'Odam, which is a person that was made to be by another person, by the reproductive system of people. So that's a new drasha, Shoifech dam ha'odam be'Odam. And once again, I say, Chazal interpret this posuk for another drasha. Eza Odam shu be'Odam. And it's an Hadinun test Chazal learned from here that B'nai Noach nerogam ala uberim. A Ben Noach kills an uber, a fetus, he's chayim, so we learn this from Odam Ba'odam. But this is an additional source of a new drash that we don't find in Chazal. And now we turn our attention to learning from Agoda. And in this part of the Shir, I want to relate very relevant questions, nuk shaidas, that modern technology thrusts upon us, and sometimes we have no source to deal with these questions. So I started this year today with a Yerushalmi that we don't learn from Lifnei Matan Torah. The question, do we learn halacha from a guy that is not addressed in Bavli, but it is addressed twice in Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi Masechet Pei Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, Yerushalmi Chagiga Zayin Amud Beis. And in these two sources, the Yerushalmi says, Ein lemeiden halacha min ha'agod. And there's a big machlokes between Gedolah Achroinim. When does this halacha apply? Pri Chodesh, Orach Chaim Kuf Chof Ches. Shvus Yankev, Chelik Beis Kuf Ayin Ches. Their opinion is that it is only when there's a contradiction between halacha and Agoda that we disregard Agoda. But if there's no contradiction in halacha, in Shas or in Poskim, we definitely could learn halacha from Agadata. Noida Yehuda has a different opinion. Chelik Beis Yoredei Kuf Samach Aleph. And I think the Noida Yehuda is right. Because if the halacha contradicts Kabbalah, I think it goes without saying that halacha overrides. And if the Yerushalmi Sosam Velo Piresh Ein Lameiden Halacha Min Agoda, that means we just don't learn halacha from Agoda. So in my sefer, I brought various different sources in which obviously sometimes we do learn halacha, but I differentiate. We definitely learn halachas from Maaser Rav, from stories that Chazal tell about Gedolah Tanoam, Gedolah Meron. We don't learn halacha from droshes. So I want to discuss with you briefly two extremely relevant questions poskim today need to deal with. And we have no source in any halachic text, only in Agoda, surrogacy. So today we have the possibility of helping so many couples having children who would have no hope just a few decades ago. So who is the halachic mother when one woman gives the egg and another woman lends her uterus. And the baby of one develops in the womb of another, who is the halachic mother. We have no source in halach. Many tshuvas were written, but the bottom line is we have no source. Two of the greatest poskim of our generation, Rav Elyoshev and Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zecher Tzadikim Barucha, both paskined. This is a question only Eliyahu Hanavi and Moshe Rabbeinu will decide. Bekorov B'tchias HaMesim, and we need to be machmir on both sides. And the relevant question is, when one of the two is non-Jewish, do we need gerus? So whether the surrogate mother is a non-Jew or the egg donor is not Jewish, in both cases, we would require gerus. And this is a question we deal with on a steady basis. The only source is a medrash. The medrash says that Leah was pregnant with Yosef and Rachel was pregnant with Dinah. And Leah turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when she pleads on the behalf of her sister, and she says, I will have 7 shvatim and my sister will have none. And Leah Tzedekis pleads with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that her sister Rachel should have Yosef. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends a malach and he transfers Dinah into the uterus of Leah and switches her with Yosef. Who was Yosef's halachic mother? Goes without saying, Rachel. So would this prove that it is the surrogate that has the halachic status of a mother and not the egg donor? So this is pure agadata, and therefore it will remain a suffix, and we will be machmir in both studies. Another relevant shaila is the relevance, the validity of DNA testing. And I'm not talking about genetics right now, about, genetics in treating in medicine. And we're dealing with about determining abahut, who is the father of a child. And the Israeli courts use this tool all the time in monetary issues. Woman had a baby. Her husband says, this is not my baby and I don't want to pay for his mezainis. And they divorced. And the father says, this is not my child. It's my neighbor's child. So he tests DNA and DNA proves it's the neighbor's child. And it is standard practice in Botei Din and in the courts in Israel, the neighbor will pay for the upbringing of that child and to support him. Would the child be defined as a mamzer? That would be quite a harsh verdict. And I say no. To determine mamzeris, we need shnei eidim. It is the status of dina nefoshes. And I think fundamentally, it's like dina nefoshes, we would rely on nothing besides eidim. But there's a fascinating medrash in Pashas Nosai. Once again, totally agadat. And the medrash says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mefarsem oivrei avera. Ishu zin sotachas bala. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would see to it that the facial features of the child will be the ones of the boil. That's not much of a miracle. That's his DNA. But even if the child belongs to the father, and the boil bared no children, Kadosh Baruch Hu would sometimes determine the facial features of the child, boil, not always, but sometimes. And I argue, well, Chazal weren't aware of DNA, but how exactly would a Kadosh Baruch Hu determine the facial features of a child to resemble one that is not his father if he doesn't play around with the DNA? So maybe the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu does that is by, toying with his DNA. So I don't know how HaKadosh Baruch Hu does things. HaKadosh Baruch Hu do things in a zillion ways. which we might understand and which we might not understand. He doesn't necessarily need to change the DNA to change a person's face. Kodesh Baruch Hu could change your face 10 times every day, and every day you will have a different face. He can do whatever he wants. But what I argue is, if a Kodesh Baruch Hu would sometimes change a child's facial features in a totally miraculous way, which is not b'derech hateva, maybe he could play around with his DNA as well. And that is an additional reason that I say you cannot determine Memzedus with a DNA test. It's not the only reason. You have others as well. Fascinating. Machlokes Rambam and Tosfos, do we rely on any umdana by Dina Nefoshes? The Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos Reish Tzadik Ches says never, and that's Exeus Akosav Noki V'Tzadik Al Taharoik. Tosfos only once in Shas. Tosfos says, Shavuos Memdala, that there is an umdana that would be relevant even by Dina Nefoshes. So the most famous umdana in Shas is the story of Shimon ben Shotach. Shimon ben Shotach sees one person chasing another and he has a sword in his hand and he runs after them. And he's 10 seconds late. By the time Reb Shimon ben Shotach walks into the room, the person is mortally wounded, gasping his last breaths of air, and the other is holding a sword dripping blood. And Reb Shimon ben Shotach says, I know that you murdered this person. What could I do? Ein dam chomoson biyodi, because I didn't see. Tosfos says, Noshoch begaboy would be sufficient even by Dina Nefoshes. Two people came into a room, and one has teeth marks on his back, and he's awfully injured. So the Gemara deals with monetary compensation because it is very unlikely that a person dies being bitten by another human being, unless he has rabies or whatever. But Tosfos writes, this is the level of an umdana would be sufficient even by Dina Nefoshes. Why? Because it's just impossible a person should bite his own back. It's an impossibility. In the story of the sword, theoretically, sounds crazy, but theoretically, maybe the person that was injured snatched the sword out of the hands of his pursuer. He committed suicide. And then the person that was running after him took the sword into his hand. Very unlikely, very unreasonable, but theoretically possible. But if only two people are in a room and one has teeth marks on his back, it's impossible that anyone else did it because a person cannot bite his own back. And that level of umdana would be sufficient even by Dina Nefoshes. That goes against the Rambam. But DNA is not umdana. It's a totally different area in Halachah. Umdana is what we define in modern language, circumstantial evidence. DNA testing is not umdana. Maybe it has to do with simonim, different sugis, not umdana. But once again, I say it is not sufficient to determine mamzerus. Bein hashar, based on this medrash, Kodesh Baruch Hu sometimes is mefarsa mo'ivra aveda. If he could change facial features, who knows? Who knows? Maybe change his DNA as well. I don't know. So I gave two examples of extremely relevant halachic discussions, and because this is modern technology, we find no sources in Halachah to deal with these questions. And our last resort is Agadata. So why, based on surrogacy, I say we do not rely on Agadata, and based on DNA testing, I do rely on Agadata for the very simple reason. This is L'chomra and that's L'kula. This is saving a person from the nega of Mamzedus. Lu Yehei Sofek. It's enough that we have a Sofek. Sofek Mamzer Mutar Menatoira. But regarding surrogacy, we would not rely on Agadata to give a definitive psak, and we would say it's a suffix forever, and therefore we would be machmir on both sides. So I think today we really discussed a very fascinating sugya, and I I'm not aware that anybody else put together these Makoidas to deal with these fundamental questions. Do we learn from Tanach? Could we make new drushes? And to what extent do we learn Halachah from Agada? We are in the midst of the 3 weeks, and Wednesday is the Chodesh Av, the beginning of the 9 days, Yemei Avelus. And these are days of mourning. In Yiddishkeit, in Jewish tradition, remembering is so important and fundamental. We are to remember our days of glory, and that is Shonosh Hagomer, the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, Kabbalas HaTorah. We are also to remember the days of tragedy, and those are the Dalet Tzoymas associated with Chorban HaBayis. When we remember the days of glory, Yetzias Mitzrayim, there's a reason. It's not only to be happy and to rejoice, to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And also, and when we are to remember the days of tragedy, it is not only to mourn. And the main objective and goal is what the Rambam writes, Perek Halachah Aleph Melchus Taniyos. Yesh sham yomim shekol yisrael mis'anim behem, mipnei atzarot she'iru behem, la'orer halavavos leftoyach bedarkei hatshuv. When we remember the tragedy of Chorban HaBayis, and we mourn la'orer halavavos bedarkei hatshuv, try to be better, try to fix what is broken. Shebezichroin hamasam ha'ele noshiv lehetiv, the Rambam writes. When we remember Chorban HaBayis, we are to examine ourselves, how we could be better. So you all remember Amam Chazal, Kol Sholei Nivnei Beis HaMikdash b'Yom Av? What do Chazal say? The only ones that remember the ones that heard me a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. The Weltzok, the world says, Kol Sholei Nivnei Beis HaMikdash b'Yom Av Keilu Charav b'Yom Av. No, that is nowhere to be found. What Chazal say is far harsher, worse. And that's Yerushalmi, Yom Edalad Amid Beis. Kol Sholei Nivnei Beis HaMikdash b'Yom Av Malam Olav Keilu Hu Hechrivo. Because when we say Keilu Charav b'Yom Av, it happened, it transpired in our days. So many different things transpired in our days. It's not the only thing. Many things happen. Good things, bad things. It didn't happen. Someone did it. And that someone is you. And each and every one of us needs to feel, if I would be better, if we would be better, we would have a Beis HaMikdash. By people, it is far easier to save a house from crashing down, to maintain a building, than to build it anew. By HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's the same. To him, it's the same. Nothing is hard for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there's no difference between maintaining a house and preventing its destruction or building it. Especially the Bayis HaShlishi, according to Rashi and Tosfos, 3 sources of Shas, it will ascend from the heavens. So if we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, that means we don't deserve one. If we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, that means if we would have a Beis HaMikdash this morning, it would be destroyed before the afternoon. Because if we would deserve one, we would have one. And that is why Malan Olav Keilu Hu Hechribo. And that is why the Rambam clearly says, remembering these days of tragedy and mourning is all about La'orer Halavavos Bedarkei Hatshuv. So what do we need to fix? This brings us back to Perek Aleph, Halachah Aleph, the very first halachas in Hilchos Taniyos. The Rambam writes, Mitzvah Sation HaTorah, Min HaTorah, Lizog V'Laharia. in days of tragedy. And number one is to believe that there is HaRav, and this is not coincidence. And the Rambam has a unique interpretation of the psukim, Im telchu imi bikeri, afani elech imochem bechamas keri. Keri is Meloshen Mikra. If you will think tragedy is coincidence, that is the source of tragedy. You need to believe when bad things befall us, as a nation, as a community, as individuals, it is controlled by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be better. And refusing to acknowledge this message from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Rambam writes, that is derech achzorius. It's not only wrong, it's not only a lack of emunah and betochen, it's cruelty. Because if you're not going to do tshuva, you're going to bring more tragedy on yourself, on your family, on your community, on Klal Yisrael. That is derech achzorius. So number one is just to believe in Hashgacha Pratis. I think last year I shared with you a story of my father when he first met the Kloisenberg Rebbe in Auschwitz, and I want to tell you the story of my mother. My mother passed away a year and a half ago. She was 93. She was an amazing woman. And some of the people in the room knew my parents and knew my mother as well. I think Reb Shlomo visited her. I think Moshe met my mother more than once, and Chaim Wolf is here, and some others, and Chaim Olinsky. She was an amazing woman in so many different ways. She arrived in Auschwitz together with 30 family members. 29 were left, and only one little girl was sent in the other direction. And my mother was terrified. And when she thought nobody is seeing, nobody is looking, she ran in the other direction towards her mother. But someone was watching. Kodesh Baruch Hu was watching. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw to it that someone else was watching as well, and that's a Nazi officer. He ran after her, punched her in the face, threw her to the ground. And my mother told us many times, by the time I got up, I no longer saw anyone. They were all gone. And with a broken heart, she went in the other direction. Whenever I tell the story, I ask, who was that Nazi that threw her to the ground? Was that Eliyahu Hanavi? I don't think so, because I don't think Eliyahu Hanavi would ever dress up in a Nazi uniform. No. He would never wear that swastika. He was a Nazi, but he was a Kodesh Baruch Hu's messenger. So one little girl went to life. She lived 93 years. In her later years, she said, this is my Nakana in Hitler. When she died, she had more than 500 descendants, all Shomer Torah. Many of them are B'tzei Torah. And that's the story of our generation. And that is Hashgacha Pratis. 29 people were sent to death, and one little girl was destined to live. And to produce a Shevet B'Yisrael. And to bring 500 descendants before she closed her eyes. Kodesh Baruch Hu controls the world, and that is Hashgacha Pratis. And that is the number one lesson when tragedy strikes. You need to believe that everything is Hashgacha Pratis. And Kodesh Baruch Hu is calling out to us, and he's talking to us, and he wants us to be better. So every year, when we realize we still don't have the Beis HaMikdash, and these are days of Churban and Avelis, we all need to try to be better. To be better, how? No one knows anyone better than he himself, and each and every one knows his shortcomings and his failures and how to be better. But fundamentally, the Navi Zechariah says, Tzoma Revi'i v'Tzoma Chamishit Tzoma Shvi'i v'Tzoma Se'i Yiyu leBeis Yehuda lesosenu lesimchu lamoedim toivim v'hu emes v'shalom ehevu. And one wonders, what does the sefer of the pasuk, the last three words, have to do with the reisha, with the beginning of the pasuk? So the pasuk could be interpreted as a blessing, as a prophecy, as a promise. I promise that these awful, tragic days will ultimately be transformed to days of joy. You would like to know, the Navi says us, when will that be? And the Navi says, I can't tell you when, but I could tell you how. When is for you to determine. That is up to you. We need to understand what brought about the Churban of Bayis Rishon and what brought about the Churban of Bayis Sheni, and we need to fix what was broken and rectify what brought about the Churban. So regarding Bayis Rishon, the Gemara says in the Doron Pei Aleph, Almo of the Haaretz, Tovasen Nishal HaChachamim Lenaviim, according to the Geras of the Bach LaMalachi Ashuras Velo Pirshuha. The HaRav said, Al Ozvon Esterosi Shalei Bochu B'Torah Tochilo. And the Ran explains, it's not about Berchus HaTorah, Lo Hisu HaTorah Chashuva Be'eneim, Velo Asku Barashma. Regarding Churban Bayis Sheni, the Gemara Yomed Avtes and Yerushalmi Yomed Avdalad Avhei, the Gemara says, sinners, they learned Torah. They were diligent in the performance of mitzvahs. So the Navi says, Torah is emes, and the only ultimate truth is Torah. And that chosem is in Torah. When you will learn to appreciate and love Torah and understand how central and important Torah is in our lives, in the life of every individual and every community, every in Klal Yisrael, and you will rectify what brought about the Churban of Bayis Rishon, and you will fix sinners. It is then that we could truly expect. שצום הרביעי וצום החמישי, צום השביעי וצום העשירי, יהיו לבית יהודה לששון ולשמחה ולמועדים טובים במהרה בימינו אמן.